that annexation 10 years ago put a foothold and kept undermining Ukraine's security since then. And that's why Crimea has to be deoccupied, because it will always remain this risk.
In the next few days, you are likely to read and hear lots marking 2 years since the start of the war in Ukraine. But actually, the war really started 10 years ago when Kremlin-backed forces invaded Crimea. That led to its annexation. It's now clear that Vladimir Putin saw it as the beginning and not the end of his attempt to swallow up territory. Let's speak to Orysia Lutsevych, Deputy Director of Russia and Eurasia Programme at Chatham House and head of the Ukraine Forum. Good morning to you, Orysia.
Good morning.
This anniversary is one that will have slipped past some people, not people in Ukraine, of course. Is this a case of we told you at the time, but you didn't listen?
Well, it's not only in Ukraine, but obviously on Times Radio, we are talking about it. And I think in other places, there will be quite a lot of reflection on what actually has happened back 10 years ago when a little creepy green men were, taking over the peninsula. But it was not only Ukrainians, I told you. So it was first the Georgians in 2008. So really, Putin's revisionist war started quite long time ago. But we were not paying enough attention to this, actually sleepwalking in a disaster we are in today. And, the Ukrainian government went on the record back from those times saying that White House was calling them actually to say that they will not be provided any support should they decide to mount a military campaign against Russian invasion of Crimea.
And why was that? Why did the White House think that the Russian invasion of Crimea was not worth defending?
Well, obviously, they did not want to escalate, as we see, this kind of fear of escalation syndrome that continues till today. I mean, it is true that Ukraine had very little capability to really resist Russians. But let's remember, like I said, they were starting in a very cowardice way to pretend that they are not there, right? That's why they were deploying special operatives without insignia on the peninsula, mobilizing local proxy groups. And then I think actually the fact that Ukraine was prevented to mount any resistance gives Russia that confidence to say that they have taken Crimea without a shot because it always wanted to be Russian.
For people who perhaps don't don't remember or don't know what was going on in Crimea historically, and also at that time 10 years ago, what was happening within Crimea that made, well, I don't know, the people within Crimea, how did they view this takeover?
Well, it'd be hard to give a long lecture of Crimea, and I'm not a historian, but briefly speaking, the peninsula throughout the beginning of the history, at the dawn of civilization, was a real and intercultural place where you could have an influence of ancient Greece, the Byzantium, some of the northern Slavic tribes, and they have all coexisted on the peninsula, and it was a big trading spot. It was the place where trade happened, similarly to the Mediterranean. But then, since the 19th century, Russian empire was obsessed by retaking the Constantinople. Catherine the Great even named her son Constantine because she was on that conquest to establish her dominance. The Crimean Wars, clearly. And then since Russia is consolidated its grip on the peninsula, they started actually deportations. The indigenous populations of Crimean Tatars were deported and then quite substantially, especially after the Second World War by Stalin, for allegedly cooperating with the Nazis. But the number I want the people to remember that in 2014, when there was a polling on the peninsula before a Russian operation, 67% wanted Crimea to remain Ukrainian. The business was blooming, mainly tourism. It's a beautiful peninsula. Historically, a lot of people were going there to see it, but also, just to spend holidays from all over the region. So Russia undermined all of that peaceful economic development because they wanted a military base. They wanted a springboard actually to project force all the way into Mediterranean, like they did in the 19th century. And Putin was right when he was asked who are his advisors. He said Catherine the Second.
Goodness me. Orysia, just finally, very briefly, if you could, do you think if Crimea hadn't happened 10 years ago, well, if that hadn't happened, what do you think the response would have been to Russia's invasion of Ukraine 2 years ago?
Well, I don't know. I think people already forgot Crimea when Putin reinvaded Kiev, but he actually had to mount that full-scale operation to take more land because Crimea is not sustainable in just the kind of control Putin had. He needed access to water. Crimea needs logistical lines, Crimea in itself was given to Ukraine because it actually in the Soviet times was taken much better care of it because of connection to the mainland. So that annexation 10 years ago put a foothold and kept undermining Ukraine's security since then. And that's why Crimea has to be deoccupied, because it will always remain this risk. It cannot be put on the ice, so to speak, and frozen. It not only undermines Ukraine, but operation in Syria, where Russia was present, was also, Crimea was important for that operation. So it is a global implication.
Orysia, thank you. It's very interesting. That is Orysia Lutsevych. She is from Chatham House.